In a quiet village in Nigeria, there lived a young man named Kunle. Kunle was known for his handsome face, charm, and smooth way with words. But there was something more that bothered him deeply: his struggle with poverty. Every day, Kunle would walk through the village, seeing his peers driving fancy cars, living in big houses, and enjoying the good things of life. He dreamed of living that kind of life, but his situation seemed hopeless. One day, while on his usual walk through the market, Kunle overheard a conversation between two old women. They were gossiping about a wealthy woman in the village named Madame Abeni. She was much older than Kunle, perhaps even old enough to be his mother. But what caught Kunle's attention was the rumor that Madame Abeni was looking for a husband. And she wasn't looking for just any man. She wanted a young, strong, and handsome man. The rumor spread like wildfire, and Kunle's mind began to race. Madame Abeni, though old, was known for her wealth. She owned several businesses, including the largest farm in the village, and was said to have piles of money stashed away. She had no children and no one to inherit her fortune.
If he married her, Kunle thought, all her wealth would eventually belong to him.
Kunle's friend, Tunde, who had heard the same rumors, laughed when Kunle mentioned the idea. "You? Marry that old woman just for her money?" Tunde teased. "Are you really that desperate?" Kunle shrugged off the taunts. "Tunde, this could be my chance to escape poverty," he said, his voice determined. "I will live the life I've always dreamed of." And so, Kunle made up his mind. The very next day, he dressed in his best clothes and went to Madame Abeni's mansion. It was grand, with high walls and beautiful gardens. Kunle's heart raced as he knocked on the large wooden door. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there stood Madame Abeni, dressed in fine silk, her grey hair wrapped neatly in a headscarf. She smiled warmly at Kunle, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "What brings a young man like you to my home?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Kunle took a deep breath and spoke boldly. "Madame Abeni, I have heard of your great wealth and your search for a husband. I believe I am the man you are looking for." Madame Abeni chuckled softly. "And why would a young handsome man like you want to marry an old woman like me?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Kunle was caught off guard by her question. He had expected her to be flattered, maybe even eager, but instead, she was calm and calculating. He fumbled for an answer, then smiled his charming smile. "Madam, it is not just your wealth that attracts me. I see a wise and strong woman who can teach me many things. Together we could build something greater." Madame Abeni stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Kunle. I will consider your proposal. But marrying me will not be as easy as you think. You must prove yourself worthy." Kunle's heart leapt with excitement. "I will do anything you ask, Madame Abeni." She smiled again, this time a little more mischievously. "Good. Let's see if you have what it takes." Kunle left the mansion that evening, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what Madame Abeni had in store for him, but he was sure of one thing. He was going to be rich. As he walked home, the sun setting behind him, he imagined the life of luxury that awaited him. But little did Kunle know, his decision to marry for money would soon lead him down a path filled with challenges and unexpected consequences. Kunle could hardly sleep that night. Thoughts of wealth and luxury filled his dreams. He imagined himself living in Madame Abeni's mansion, driving expensive cars, and dining at the finest restaurants. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Madame Abeni's words about proving himself were a warning. What kind of test would she give him? The next morning, as the sun rose, Kunle made his way back to Madame Abeni's mansion. His heart was pounding, but he kept reminding himself of his goal, the money, the riches, the life he always wanted. When he arrived at the mansion, he was greeted by Madame Abeni's housekeeper, Mama Ekaete, an elderly woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through Kunle. "Madam is expecting you," she said, gesturing for him to follow. Kunle was led to the grand sitting room, where Madame Abeni sat sipping tea. She greeted him with a calm smile but wasted no time. "Kunle," she began, "you said you wanted to marry me. But before we can discuss that further, I need to know if you are a man of your word." Kunle nodded eagerly. "I am, madam. I will do anything to prove myself." Madame Abeni leaned back in her chair and looked at him closely. "Very well. Your first task is simple but important. I want you to take this basket of food to my workers at the farm," she said, pointing to a large woven basket on the table. Kunle was confused. A task this simple couldn't be what she meant by proving himself, could it? But he didn't argue. "Of course, madam," he said, picking up the basket. The farm was located on the outskirts of the village, and Kunle made his way there. It was a long walk under the scorching sun, and by the time he arrived, he was exhausted. But what surprised him most was the size of the farm. It was enormous, with rows of crops stretching as far as the eye could see. The workers, who were busy tending to the fields, looked up as Kunle approached. Baba Saliu, the foreman, was an old man who had been working for Madame Abeni for as long as anyone could remember. He eyed Kunle suspiciously. "You must be the new young man Madame Abeni has been talking about," Baba Saliu said, wiping sweat from his brow. "What brings you here?" Kunle handed him the basket. "Madame Abeni sent me to bring food for the workers," he explained. Baba Saliu nodded but didn't seem impressed. She's testing you, you know?" Kunle frowned. "Testing me? How?" The old man chuckled. "If you think carrying a basket of food is all there is, you're in for a surprise." Kunle was about to ask what he meant when one of the workers called out. There was a problem at the far end of the farm. The irrigation system had broken, and without water, the crops would die. Kunle watched as the workers scrambled to fix the issue, but it was clear they needed help. This was his chance to show that he was capable. Without thinking twice, Kunle rolled up his sleeves and joined the workers in repairing the system. It was tough work, and the sun beat down mercilessly, but Kunle pushed through, determined to prove himself. Hours later, the irrigation system was fixed, and water flowed through the fields once again. Baba Saliu patted Kunle on the back. "You did good, boy. Maybe you're not just here for the money after all." Kunle smiled, though his body ached from the labor. He hadn't expected to work so hard, but he was proud of himself. Maybe this was what Madame Abeni wanted to see, that he wasn't afraid of hard work. When Kunle returned to the mansion later that evening, Madame Abeni was waiting for him. She looked at him, sweaty and tired, and nodded approvingly. "You did well today, Kunle," she said. "But that was just the beginning. If you truly want to be with me, there will be more challenges ahead. Remember, a life of wealth requires more than just desire, it requires strength and endurance." Kunle felt a chill run down his spine. He had passed the first test, but it was clear that Madame Abeni had much more in store for him. As he left the mansion that night, Kunle wondered if he had made the right choice. The promise of wealth still called to him, but at what cost? What other challenges would he have to face before he could claim the life he wanted? Kunle woke up the next morning with aching muscles and a restless mind. His determination to marry Madame Abeni and live the life of wealth and luxury had not faded, but now he realized that getting there might be more difficult than he had imagined. What other tests would Madame Abeni throw his way? As the sun rose over the village, Kunle prepared himself for another day at Madame Abeni's mansion. When he arrived, Mama Ekaete greeted him at the door again, this time with a serious look on her face. "Madam is waiting for you in the garden," she said, and without another word, she led him through the large mansion to the back, where the lush green garden spread out like a paradise. Kunle spotted Madame Abeni sitting on a stone bench, admiring the beautiful flowers that filled the air with sweet fragrance. She motioned for him to sit beside her. "Kunle," she began, her voice soft but firm. "You handled the farm well yesterday. I see you are not afraid of hard work, and that is a good thing. But a marriage to me is not just about physical strength. You must prove that you can handle responsibility and that you can think on your feet." Kunle nodded, eager to prove himself again. "What do you want me to do, madam?" Madame Abeni's eyes twinkled, as though she knew something Kunle didn't. "Today, I need you to handle something delicate. I want you to go to the market and collect money from my debtors. Some of them owe me large sums, and I need someone I can trust to bring it back safely." Kunle's heart skipped a beat. He knew the market was a lively place, but it was also full of people who would do anything to avoid paying their debts. And carrying large sums of money in public could be dangerous. But Kunle couldn't back down now. "Consider it done, madam," Kunle said confidently. Madame Abeni handed him a list of names and amounts. "Be careful, Kunle. Some people will not want to part with their money easily. Use your charm, but don't be foolish." Kunle set off for the market, determined to succeed. As he walked through the busy streets, the hustle and bustle of people bargaining, selling, and trading filled the air. He approached the first name on the list, a man named Alhaji Musa, who ran a fabric stall. "Good afternoon, Alhaji," Kunle greeted him politely. "Madame Abeni has sent me to collect what you owe." Alhaji Musa, a stout man with a bushy beard, frowned when he heard Madame Abeni's name. "That woman again, always asking for her money," he muttered under his breath. But after a moment, he sighed and handed Kunle a bag of coins. "Here, take it. Tell her that's the last time she'll see me owing anything." Kunle smiled and thanked him before moving on to the next debtor, a woman named Iyasade who sold spices. But things weren't as easy with her. When Kunle approached her and mentioned Madame Abeni's name, her eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "Tell Madame Abeni I don't have her money," Iyasade snapped. "Times are hard and I haven't made enough to pay her back." Kunle hesitated, remembering Madame Abeni's warning. He tried to reason with Iyasade. Madame Abeni is fair, and she wouldn't ask for more than what's owed. "Perhaps you can give what you have for now, and we can arrange the rest later." But Iyasade was stubborn. "No, I'm not giving a single naira until my business picks up." Kunle felt the tension rising. He knew this was a test of his patience and negotiation skills, but he also didn't want to leave empty-handed. After a moment of thinking, he decided to back off for now. "Very well, Iyasade. I'll inform Madame Abeni of your situation." As Kunle continued collecting debts, he encountered similar resistance from some and cooperation from others. By the end of the day, he had gathered a respectable amount of money, but there were still a few names left unpaid. He knew Madame Abeni would want to know what happened. When Kunle returned to the mansion, he found Madame Abeni waiting for him in the grand hall. She looked at the money he had collected and then raised an eyebrow. Not all of it, I see, she remarked calmly. Kunle nodded, his hands slightly trembling. I did my best, madam. Some people are struggling and couldn't pay today. But I assured them you would understand. Madame Abeni stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. He had passed another test. But as he prepared to leave for the night, Madame Abeni called him back. Kunle, she said softly. You're doing well, but you must understand something. Marrying me won't just give you wealth. It will also come with great responsibility. You'll be expected to manage my affairs, protect what I've built, and face challenges much greater than the ones you've seen so far. Kunle nodded, though his mind was filled with questions. Was this really what he wanted? The money still called to him, but the weight of responsibility was beginning to show itself. As he walked home, Kunle wondered what the future held. Would Madame Abeni's wealth be worth the trials he was facing, and what other tests awaited him before he could claim the life he desired? Kunle's mind was clouded with doubt as he made his way back to Madame Abeni's mansion the next morning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the village. The tests Madame Abeni had put him through were becoming more than simple tasks. They were forcing him to confront what kind of man he truly was. Yet, every time he questioned himself, the thought of wealth, of finally escaping poverty, pushed him forward. As he approached the mansion, Mama Ekaite met him at the gate with a more somber look than usual. Madame Abeni is expecting you in her private chambers today, she said, her voice softer than before. When Kunle entered the chambers, he saw Madame Abeni seated at an ornate table covered in papers, ledgers, and documents. It was clear she was the one truly running everything in the village, and the sight of her, immersed in her work, reminded Kunle of just how powerful she was. She paused, leaning forward as if to study his face. Today, I need your help with something delicate. There's a piece of land that belongs to a widow, Mama Folek. She's behind on her payments and, unfortunately, I must either take the land or make a deal that will leave her with nothing. I want you to handle this negotiation. Kunle's heart sank. He had heard of Mama Folak, a poor elderly woman who had lost her husband and struggled to care for her children. The idea of taking away the little she had left didn't sit well with him, but the look on Madame Abeni's face told him this was part of the test. This was more than about handling money, it was about loyalty, and perhaps ruthlessness. Madam, Kunle began cautiously. I understand the importance of business, but isn't there another way? Perhaps we could give her more time? Madame Abeni smiled faintly, though her eyes remained sharp. That is for you to decide, Kunle. But remember, business is not about sentiment. It's about survival and strength. I'm asking you to handle this not just as a task, but as a decision maker. What you choose will tell me if you are ready to stand beside me in this life. Kunle left the mansion in deep thought. For the first time, the weight of his ambition felt heavy. It wasn't just about tasks anymore, it was about becoming someone capable of making hard moral choices. He had to decide what kind of man he would be if he continued down this path. When Kunle arrived at Mama Folek's small rundown home, he found her sitting outside with her children, tending to her garden. She looked up and smiled warmly when she saw him approach, not knowing the burden he carried. Kunle, my son, it's good to see you, she said, her voice gentle. Kunle struggled to find his words. Mama Folaka, I've come to talk about the land, he said hesitantly. Madame Abeni sent me. The warmth in Mama Folak's face faded. She knew what this visit meant. He knelt beside Mama Folake, his voice low but firm. I want to help you, Mama. Madame Abeni wants the land, but I believe there's another way. If I can convince her to give you more time, would you be able to make the payments? Mama Folake's eyes filled with tears. I would try, Kunle. I swear on my husband's name, I will do everything I can. Kunle knew the risks. Going back to Madame Abeni with a compromise instead of enforcing her will could mean the end of his chances with her. But something in his heart told him that doing the right thing mattered more than wealth. When Kunle returned to Madame Abeni later that evening, his hands were trembling. She sat, as always, in her grand chamber, waiting for his report. Did you take care of it? She asked, her voice cool and controlled. Kunle stood tall, though he could feel the weight of his decision. I spoke with Mama Folake. She's willing to make the payments if given more time. I didn't take the land, madam. Madame Abeni's eyes narrowed, and the room felt as if it had grown colder. You disobeyed me, she said softly, her voice laced with disappointment. Kunle swallowed hard. I didn't disobey you, madam. I made a decision. You asked me to think like a man who could stand by your side. That's what I've done. I believe there's value in giving her a chance. For what felt like an eternity, Madame Abeni said nothing. She simply stared at Kunle, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. You've surprised me, Kunle, she said slowly. Madame Abeni rose from her chair and walked toward him, her gaze unwavering. This test wasn't just about business. It was about seeing whether you could make a hard choice and stand by it, even if it meant losing what you wanted. You've passed. For now. Kunle exhaled, the tension in his body releasing, but he knew this was far from the end. Madame Abeni was still a mystery, and he had a long way to go before he could truly understand her world. As Kunle left the mansion that night, he realized that the path he had chosen was more complicated than he had imagined. Wealth wasn't just about riches, it came with heavy responsibilities and moral dilemmas. He had passed another test, but at what cost? Kunle's nights were becoming restless, filled with dreams of Madame Abeni's tests and the growing weight of his choices. His once simple desire for wealth had led him down a path he hadn't anticipated. He had passed the most recent challenge by following his conscience, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Madame Abeni's approval was fragile. The next morning, as Kunle walked through the village, whispers followed him. It seemed the villagers were already talking about him. Some admired his courage for standing up to Madame Abeni, while others doubted he had what it took to survive in her world. When he arrived at the mansion, Mama Akete greeted him, as always, but this time with a curious expression. You're making waves, young man, she said, her tone carrying both caution and approval. But be careful. Madame Abeni doesn't test people for fun. Kunle nodded, feeling the tension in his gut. He knew Mama Eketi was right. Madame Abeni's tests weren't just about proving his worth, they were about shaping him. He wondered how much of himself he was willing to lose for wealth. He was led into Madame Abeni's grand sitting room, where she was seated, staring out of the large window that overlooked her vast estate. When Kunle entered, she turned, her face unreadable. Kunle, she began, you've proven to me that you can make tough decisions, but there's more to being by my side than just choosing between right and wrong. Loyalty, absolute loyalty, is what I demand. Today, you'll be tested in that regard. Kunle tensed. The way she spoke made him uneasy, as though the challenge ahead would push him further than before. I have a close associate, Chief Okoye, Madame Abeni continued. We've been doing business together for years, but recently, I've learned that he's been dishonest, stealing from our shared ventures. However, Chief Okoye is powerful, and confronting him could have consequences. Your task today is simple. I want you to find out if he's truly betraying me. Kunle frowned. And if he is? Madam Abeni's eyes hardened. If he is, you'll expose him. But be careful, he's not a man to be taken lightly. Kunle left the mansion, his mind swirling with uncertainty. Investigating a man as powerful as Chief Okoye was dangerous. One wrong step, and he could make a powerful enemy. Yet, he couldn't refuse. This was his test of loyalty. When Kunle arrived at Chief Okoye's estate, it was nothing short of magnificent. Grand pillars held up a massive stone house, surrounded by lush gardens and expensive cars. Chief Okoye was a man of influence, with connections that stretched far beyond the village. The guards at the gate let Kunle in, and soon he was face to face with the chief. Chief Okoye greeted Kunle with a hearty laugh and a firm handshake. "Ah, Kunle," Chief Okoye boomed. "I've heard of you, the young man Madam Abeni has taken an interest in. To what do I owe this visit?" Kunle forced a smile, trying to stay composed. "I've come to discuss some business matters on behalf of Madam Abeni," he said carefully, choosing his words. "There have been some concerns about recent transactions, and I've been asked to clarify a few things." Chief Okoye's smile faltered slightly, but he kept his jovial demeanor. "Concerns? What kind of concerns?" Kunle hesitated. He could sense the tension growing in the room, but he had to stay focused. "It seems there have been discrepancies in the profits from your joint ventures with Madam Abeni. I'm here to find out if there's an explanation." For a moment, Chief Okoye's face darkened. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You're accusing me of stealing from her, aren't you?" Kunle knew he had to tread carefully. "No accusations, Chief. I'm simply here to gather information." The chief stood up, his eyes flashing with anger. "Let me tell you something, boy. You're playing a dangerous game, aligning yourself with Madam Abeni. She's powerful, yes, but her power doesn't reach as far as mine. You're smart to be loyal to her, but if you cross me, you'll regret it." Kunle felt his heart race. The chief's warning wasn't empty. He was in dangerous waters, and one wrong move could cost him everything. But he also knew that going back to Madame Abeni without answers wasn't an option. Taking a deep breath, Kunle stood his ground. "Chief, I'm only doing my job. If there's nothing to hide, then this should be a simple matter to resolve." For a long moment, Chief Okoye glared at Kunle, his expression unreadable. Then, to Kunle's surprise, the chief's face broke into a smile once more, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Very well, Kunle, you'll have your answers. But remember this, loyalty is a dangerous thing. It can change overnight." Kunle left the estate feeling unsettled. Chief Okoye had given him some documents to take back to Madame Abeni, but something about the interaction didn't sit right with him. He couldn't tell if the chief was hiding something or if he had just been warned to stay out of things he didn't understand. When Kunle returned to Madame Abeni's mansion, he handed her the documents, his mind still racing with uncertainty. She flipped through them, her face unreadable. Then she looked up at Kunle. "What do you think?" she asked. Kunle hesitated. He knew that his answer mattered. This was another test of loyalty. "I think Chief Okoye is hiding something, madam," he said slowly. "He gave me the documents, but I don't trust him." Madam Abeni nodded, her expression cool. "Good. You've learned to trust your instincts. Chief Okoye has been a valuable partner for many years, but loyalty can fade, especially when money is involved. She stood up, walking to the window and gazing out over her estate. Kunle, you've passed another test. But remember, loyalty is more important than anything. In this world, people will betray you for far less than you imagine. Kunle felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. Each test was pulling him deeper into Madame Abeni's world, and with each step, he felt his moral compass being challenged. The promise of wealth was still there, but the cost was becoming clearer. As he left the mansion that evening, Kunle wondered if loyalty to Madame Abeni would mean losing his loyalty to himself. Kunle's steps felt heavier with each day. The pressure of Madame Abeni's tests weighed on his conscience. He could sense that something big was coming, something that would force him to make a final decision. Was this life of wealth and power really worth the cost? He had seen the influence and luxury that came with Madame Abeni's world, but also the moral compromises, the corruption, and the pain it brought to others. As he arrived at the mansion, the air felt different, thicker, more tense. Mama Eketi greeted him with a concerned look. Madame Abeni is waiting for you in the main hall, she said quietly. Kunle entered the grand hall, where Madame Abeni stood beside a large table, a small wooden box in front of her. Her eyes were sharper than ever, and the air around her seemed to crackle with authority. Kunle, she began, her voice steady, you've proven yourself capable, loyal, and strong. But today is the final test. What I'm about to ask you will determine your future, not just with me, but in this world of wealth and power. Kunle's heart pounded. He had been expecting something difficult, but the intensity in Madame Abeni's gaze made him realize this was more than just another challenge. She gestured to the wooden box on the table. Inside this box is a document, a contract. It's a deal with Chief Okoye. You remember him, don't you? He's betrayed me, as you suspected. This contract will ruin him, financially and socially. By signing it, you'll ensure that I rise above him, and that our partnership will grow stronger. But you'll also be helping to destroy a man's life. Kunle's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The final test wasn't about physical endurance or cleverness, it was about his soul. Was he willing to crush someone else for the sake of wealth and power? Madame Abeni continued, her eyes locked onto his. If you sign it, Kunle, your place beside me will be guaranteed. You'll have all the wealth you've ever dreamed of. But understand this, signing it will mean you've chosen this life, fully and completely. There's no going back. Kunle stared at the box, his mind racing. He had come so far. He had passed every test. The promise of wealth, comfort and influence lay just within his grasp. But at what cost? Was he truly ready to destroy another man's life for his own gain? Finally Kunle spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Madame Abeni, I've learned a lot from you. You've shown me how the world works, how power can be used to control people, and how wealth can change lives. But I've also learned something more important. There are some things money can't buy. Madame Abeni's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to flicker with understanding. I can't sign that contract, Kunle continued. I won't be responsible for destroying another person's life, no matter how much it benefits me. If I have to lose everything to keep my integrity, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. For a long moment, the room was silent. Madame Abeni stared at Kunle, her face unreadable. Then to his surprise, a slow smile spread across her lips. You've made your choice, she said softly. And it's a brave one. Kunle blinked, unsure of what to make of her reaction. Madame Abeni walked over to him, her tone suddenly warmer. almost approving. This was the real test, Kunle. I needed to see if you were willing to sacrifice your soul for wealth. Many men would have signed that contract without a second thought. But you didn't. That tells me you're stronger than I thought. Kunle frowned, confused. So, this was all? Madame Abeni nodded. Yes. I've been testing more than your loyalty. I've been testing your character. And you've shown me that you're a man who values more than just riches. You've passed the final test. Kunle felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't lost himself after all. But he knew this meant the end of his path with Madame Abeni. I understand if this means I can't be by your side anymore, Kunle said, his voice steady. Madame Abeni smiled. You're right. This life isn't for you, Kunle. But that doesn't mean you've failed. In fact, you've succeeded in the most important way. You've stayed true to who you are. And that is something far more valuable than any wealth I could offer. Kunle nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. He had made the right choice, and he was ready to move forward, without the riches, but with his integrity intact. As he left Madame Abeni's mansion for the last time, Kunle knew that his journey wasn't over. He would find his way in the world, but this time, he would do it on his own terms. Kunle woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity but also lingering confusion. The weight of Madame Abeni's tests had left him both exhausted and curious. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her challenges than met the eye. What was her true intention? Why was she pushing him so hard? As he made his way to Madame Abeni's mansion, the morning sun cast a golden glow over the village. Kunle found himself replaying the events of the last few days, trying to make sense of it all. By the time he arrived, Mama Ekaiti was waiting for him at the door, her expression more serious than usual. Kunle, she said, her voice low, Madame Abeni has something important to discuss with you today. Be prepared. Kunle nodded, his heart pounding as he stepped into the grand sitting room. Madame Abeni was seated by the window, her usual regal presence softened by a pensive look. She gestured for him to sit. Kunle, she began, her voice calm but firm, you've come far, and you've shown qualities I rarely see in people. But before we continue, I need to share something with you. Kunle leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. Years ago, Madame Abeni continued, I was much like you. Ambitious, determined, and eager to escape poverty. I was willing to do whatever it took to rise above my circumstances. But in my pursuit of wealth, I made mistakes that cost me dearly. Kunle leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. Years ago, Madame Abeni continued, I was much like you, ambitious, determined, and eager to escape poverty. I was willing to do whatever it took to rise above my circumstances. But in my pursuit of wealth, I made mistakes that cost me dearly. Her voice faltered for a moment, and Kunle noticed a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. I lost people I cared about, she admitted. I became someone I didn't recognize. And now I see that same fire in you, the same hunger. I've been testing you because I wanted to see if you could succeed without losing yourself like I did. Kunle was stunned. He hadn't expected such a personal revelation from Madame Abeni. Her words made him question his own journey and what he was truly chasing. Madame Abeni straightened in her chair, her tone sharpening. Today, I have another task for you. But this one is different. It's not about money or loyalty. It's about trust. Kunle's brow furrowed. What do you mean, madam? She handed him a sealed envelope. There's a woman in the neighboring village, Auntie Unkim. She's a close friend of mine, and I need you to deliver this to her. But understand this. She's someone who values honesty above all else. Your words and actions will matter more than you think. Kunle accepted the envelope, sensing the gravity of the task. He didn't ask any further questions, knowing that Madame Abeni would reveal more only if she wanted to. The journey to the neighboring village was long, but Kunle's mind was busy with thoughts. Who was Auntie Nkem, and why was this task so important? The landscape changed as he approached the village. Fields of crops stretched out under the sun, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and flowers. When he arrived at Auntie Nkem's modest home, he was greeted by a warm but stern-looking woman in her late 50s. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. "You must be Kunle," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Madame Abeni told me you'd be coming." Kunle nodded and handed her the envelope. As she opened it and read its contents, her expression changed. First surprise, then a mix of emotions Kunle couldn't quite read. "You've been tested, haven't you?" she asked, folding the letter carefully. "Yes, ma'am," Kunle replied. "I've been doing my best to prove myself to Madame Abeni." Auntie Nkem studied him for a moment. "And what have you learned so far?" Kunle hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I've learned that wealth isn't just about money, it's about responsibility, trust, and staying true to yourself. But I'm still figuring out what it all means." Auntie Nkem smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Good. Because the next step in your journey will require more than just effort. It will require you to understand who you are and what you stand for." Kunle felt a chill run down his spine. This task was far from over. Kunle left Auntie Nkem's home with a growing sense of unease. Her cryptic words echoed in his mind. Understand who you are and what you stand for. What could Madame Abeni have written to provoke such a response? His curiosity burned, but he knew better than to open the letter himself. As he walked back to Madame Abeni's mansion, Kunle couldn't help but notice how different the neighboring village was. The people seemed content, their lives simpler, their focus less on wealth and more on community. For the first time, Kunle questioned if the life he sought was truly what he needed. When he returned, Madame Abeni was waiting for him in her garden, her usual air of composure intact. Kunle handed her the letter without a word. She opened it, scanned its contents, and gave a faint nod, as if confirming something to herself. "Did Auntie Nkem say anything to you?" Madame Abeni asked, her tone unusually soft. "She asked me what I've learned," Kunle replied honestly. "And she told me the next step in my journey would require understanding who I am." Madame Abeni smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the flowers around them. "Auntie Nkem has always had a way of cutting to the heart of things. But she's right. You've come far, Kunle, but the hardest part is yet to come." Kunle tensed. "What do you mean, madam?" She turned to face him, her expression serious. "There's something you need to know about me, something I haven't told you. Everything I've put you through has been to prepare you, not just for life, but for a decision that will change both of our futures." Kunle's brow furrowed. "A decision? What kind of decision?" Madame Abeni hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Years ago, I made a pact with someone I trusted, a promise to pass on everything I've built to someone who proves themselves worthy. Someone who shows not just loyalty but also the strength to make difficult choices. That person, Kunle, could be you." Kunle's breath caught. Was she talking about handing over her wealth and estate to him? The possibility felt overwhelming, almost unreal. "But why me?" Kunle asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Because you remind me of myself," Madame Abeni said simply. "You have the ambition, the fire, and the potential to lead. But before I can entrust you with everything, I need to be certain you won't repeat my mistakes. Kunle's heart raced. This wasn't just about money or power, this was about becoming someone worthy of a legacy. What do I need to do? He asked. Madame Abeni's eyes softened. There's one final task. Tomorrow, you will meet with Chief Okoye again. But this time, it won't be about accusations or contracts. You'll need to negotiate a partnership with him, on my behalf and under my terms. Kunle's stomach churned. Chief Okoye was a powerful man, one who had already shown his willingness to play dirty. Could he really stand up to him? And what if he refuses? Kunle asked. Then you'll need to decide how far you're willing to go to secure the deal, Madame Abeni replied, her tone leaving no room for doubt. This isn't just a test of your skill, it's a test of your integrity. How you handle this will determine everything. Kunle nodded, though his mind was spinning. He left the garden with a heavy heart, knowing the next day would be a turning point. Kunle arrived at Chief Okoye's estate, the envelope with Madame Abeni's terms clutched tightly in his hand. The estate was as grand as he remembered, but this time, Kunle felt a stronger resolve. He wasn't the same person who had walked through those gates weeks ago. Chief Okoye greeted him with a sly smile, his imposing frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. Kunle, back so soon? What does Madame Abeni want this time? Kunle met his gaze without flinching. She has a proposition for you. A partnership that could benefit both of you. But it's on her terms. Chief Okoye's smile faded, replaced by a look of suspicion. Her terms, you say? And what makes her think I'd agree to that? Kunle handed him the envelope, watching as Chief Okoye opened it and read. His expression darkened, and Kunle braced himself for the backlash. This is bold, Chief Okoye said finally, his voice low and dangerous. She wants me to concede my control over the joint ventures? To let her call the shots? It's a fair deal, Kunle said, his voice steady. You'd still profit, and it would ensure stability for both of you. Chief Okoye chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Kunle's spine. You've got guts, boy, but guts won't protect you when you're dealing with people like me. Kunle squared his shoulders. Maybe not. But I'm not here to protect myself. I'm here to represent Madame Abeni. And she's offering you a chance to move forward peacefully. Chief Okoye studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You've got fire, I'll give you that. But fire can burn you if you're not careful. Kunle didn't respond, waiting as Chief Okoye mulled over the terms. Finally, the older man smirked. Tell Madame Abeni I'll consider it. But don't think this is over. Kunle exhaled, his heart pounding as he left the estate. The encounter had been tense, but he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had stood his ground and stayed true to his principles. When he returned to Madame Abeni, she was waiting for him in the grand hall. Her eyes searched his face as he relayed what had happened. You've done well, Kunle, she said softly. But this isn't the end. There's still more to learn, and more to decide. Kunle nodded, his resolve strengthening. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. Kunle awoke the next morning with a newfound sense of determination. The encounter with Chief Okoye had tested his resolve, but he felt stronger, more focused. Madame Abeni's cryptic words about a legacy still lingered in his mind. What did she mean by preparing him to carry on her work? When he arrived at the mansion, Mama Ekaete greeted him with an approving nod. You've been through a lot, young man, she said softly. But you're not done yet. Madam is waiting for you in the library. Kunle felt a sense of unease as he walked toward the grand library. The room was one of the most opulent in the mansion, lined with shelves of ancient books and illuminated by the soft glow of a chandelier. Madame Abeni stood at the far end, holding a leather-bound journal. You handled Chief Okoye well, she said without turning around. But there's more you need to understand about the path you're on. Kunle approached cautiously. I'm listening, madam. Madame Abeni's eyes softened. There's one final task. Tomorrow, you will meet with Chief Okoye again. But this time, it won't be about accusations or contracts. You'll need to negotiate a partnership with him, on my behalf and under my terms. She turned to face him, her expression serious. This journal contains the details of every decision I've made to build what you see here. The victories, the mistakes, and the sacrifices. If you're going to take on this legacy, you need to understand the weight of it. Kunle hesitated as she handed him the journal. Its leather cover was worn, and the pages inside seemed to hum with the energy of untold secrets. You want me to read this? Not just read it, she said firmly. Learn from it. The choices I made didn't just affect me. They shaped the lives of everyone around me. If you're going to step into my shoes, you need to be prepared for the burden that comes with power. Kunle nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. He left the library with the journal in hand, his mind buzzing with questions. What kind of sacrifices had Madame Abeni made? And could he avoid making the same mistakes? That evening, Kunle sat in his modest room, the journal open on his lap. The pages were filled with Madame Abeni's meticulous handwriting, detailing her journey from a poor village girl to a powerful businesswoman. Her words painted a picture of determination and resilience, but also of loss and regret. One entry caught his attention. To gain power, I had to let go of love. To secure wealth, I had to make choices that haunted me. But the hardest part was losing trust, first in others and eventually in myself. Kunle's heart sank. Madame Abeni's life was far from the glamorous image she projected. Her wealth had come at a cost he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. The following morning, Madame Abeni called Kunle to her office. Her demeanor was calm, but her eyes held a glint of anticipation. Today, I'm sending you to oversee a deal with one of our most important partners, she said. This deal is critical, not just for the business, but for the people it will impact. If it falls apart, the consequences will ripple far and wide. Kunle straightened his posture. What do I need to do? You need to ensure the deal goes through on fair terms, she replied. But the partner, Mr. Adewale, is known for being difficult. He'll try to intimidate you. He'll try to push you into agreeing to terms that benefit him more than us. Kunle nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was his biggest challenge yet. The meeting was held in a sleek modern office building in the city. Mr. Adewale, a sharp-dressed man in his late 40s, greeted Kunle with a cold smile. His confidence was palpable, and his handshake was firm enough to feel like a warning. Let's get straight to business, Adewale said, sliding a contract across the table. These are my terms. Kunle read through the document carefully. As expected, the terms heavily favored Mr. Adewale. He took a deep breath and looked up, meeting the man's piercing gaze. These terms aren't fair, Kunle said evenly. They leave too much risk on our side. Adewale leaned back in his chair, smirking. Fairness is subjective, young man. In business you take what you can get. Perhaps, Kunle replied, his voice steady. But fairness builds trust, and trust builds partnerships that last. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Adewale leaned forward, his expression hardening. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't get you far if you can't deliver. Kunle didn't back down. Neither will greed. Adewale's eyes narrowed, but after a long pause, he broke into a grudging smile. Fine, let's renegotiate. When Kunle returned to Madame Abeni's mansion, he was exhausted but proud. The deal had been finalized, and the terms were fair for both parties. Madame Abeni listened intently as Kunle recounted the meeting, her expression unreadable as always. You've done well, she said finally. But there's one more thing you need to understand. Kunle waited, his heart pounding. This journey isn't just about wealth or power, she said. It's about legacy. And legacy isn't built in a day. It's built through the choices you make every single day. Kunle nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. Kunle couldn't shake the feeling that something was still being kept from him. Madame Abeni's journal had revealed parts of her story, but it left him with more questions than answers. What was the true cost of her legacy? And why had she chosen him to carry it forward? That morning, Madame Abeni called him to the library. When he arrived, she was seated at the grand desk, a faded photograph in her hands. Her usually composed demeanor seemed softer, almost vulnerable. Kunle, she began, her voice quieter than usual. There's something you need to know about why I've been preparing you. She handed him the photograph. It was old and grainy, showing a much younger Madame Abeni standing beside a man Kunle didn't recognize. The man had a strong, confident presence, with an unmistakable resemblance to Kunle. Who is this? Kunle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Madame Abeni's eyes glistened. That man was your father. Kunle froze. My father, but how? Madame Abeni leaned back, her gaze distant. Years ago, your father and I were partners, not just in business, but in life. We built everything you see here together. But we had different ideas about how to move forward. He wanted to build slowly, with integrity. I wanted to grow quickly, no matter the cost. Eventually, we parted ways. Kunle's mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. But he never told me about you. He passed away when I was a child. Madame Abeni nodded. He never forgave me for the choices I made. But when I learned about you, I saw an opportunity to right my wrongs. That's why I chose you, Kunle. You're his son, and I believe you can carry on the legacy we started, without making the mistakes I did. Kunle felt a mix of emotions, shock, anger, and a strange sense of clarity. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I needed to see if you were ready, Madame Abeni said firmly. And now, I believe you are. Kunle spent the rest of the day reflecting on what he had learned. His entire life had been shaped by his father's absence, and now he was being asked to step into a role he hadn't even known existed. That evening, he confronted Madame Abeni in the garden. If I take on this legacy, he said, I need to do it my way. No shortcuts, no betrayals. I won't repeat the mistakes you made. Madame Abeni smiled faintly. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. The next morning, Madame Abeni gave Kunle his most ambitious task yet. There's a struggling village nearby, she explained. It's one of the places your father and I once tried to help. I want you to go there, assess their needs, and come up with a plan to support them. Kunle was taken aback. Support them how? That's for you to decide, she replied. This isn't just about business, it's about leadership and responsibility. Kunle set out for the village, determined to prove himself. When he arrived, he was struck by the level of poverty and hardship. The people welcomed him warmly, but their eyes were filled with quiet desperation. He spent the day speaking with villagers, learning about their struggles and dreams. By nightfall, he had a plan. To use Madame Abeni's resources to fund agricultural training and provide tools to help the village become self-sufficient. When Kunle returned to Madame Abeni's mansion, he presented his plan with confidence. Instead of just giving them money, we can empower them to build a future for themselves. It's what my father would have wanted. Madame Abeni listened intently, then nodded. You've shown me that you're ready, Kunle. The choices you've made reflect the man you've become. You've earned the right to carry this legacy forward. Kunle felt a surge of pride, but also a sense of responsibility. He knew this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. Kunle stood at the threshold of a new chapter in his life, armed with Madame Abeni's approval and his plan for the struggling village. But as he soon discovered, the road to leadership was fraught with obstacles. The morning after presenting his plan, Kunle was approached by Mama Ikaete. Her usually calm demeanor was tinged with concern. Kunle, she began, some of Madame Abeni's business partners aren't happy with your decisions. They think you're too young and inexperienced to take on this responsibility. Kunle frowned. What do they expect me to do? Ignore the needs of the village? Mama Ikaete sighed. They don't care about the village. They care about profits. You'll need to stand your ground if you want to make this work. Later that day, Kunle was summoned to a meeting with Madame Abeni's key business partners, a group of older men and women who had been instrumental in building her empire. Chief Okoye was among them, his piercing gaze fixed on Kunle. Kunle, Chief Okoye began, we've heard about your plan for the village. While it's admirable, it's not practical. Helping them will drain resources that could be used for more profitable ventures. Kunle met his gaze, refusing to back down. The resources are Madame Abeni's, and she approved this plan. It's not just about profits, it's about creating a sustainable future for the people who need it most. A woman named Mrs. Adisa, known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude, leaned forward. And what guarantees do we have that this plan will succeed? If it fails, it'll tarnish Madame Abeni's reputation. Kunle took a deep breath, steadying himself. There are no guarantees. But if we don't try, we risk losing something more important than money, our humanity. This is about legacy, not just business. The room fell silent. Chief Okoye's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You've got guts, boy. Let's hope your plan works. For your sake. With the reluctant approval of the business partners, Kunle set to work. He returned to the village with a team of agricultural experts, tools, and funds to kickstart the initiative. The villagers were initially skeptical, but Kunle's determination won them over. Days turned into weeks as the village began to transform. Fields that had once been barren were now lush with crops. Women and men attended training sessions on sustainable farming, and the community spirit grew stronger with each passing day. Kunle worked alongside the villagers, earning their trust and respect. He found himself inspired by their resilience and determination. Just as things seemed to be going well, Kunle received troubling news. One of Madame Abeni's rivals, Mr. Badejo, had heard about the project and was spreading rumors that it was a scam to funnel money away from her estate. The rumors began to reach her business partners, reigniting their doubts. Kunle confronted Madame Abeni about it. Mr. Badejo is trying to sabotage us, he said, frustration evident in his voice. What can we do? Madame Abeni's expression was calm but stern. You need to handle this, Kunle. Prove to everyone that your plan is working. Actions speak louder than words. Kunle nodded, realizing that this was yet another test of his leadership. Kunle arranged a meeting with Mr. Badejo, determined to put an end to the rumors. The rival businessman was a shrewd, calculating man who thrived on chaos. Kunle, Badejo said with a sly smile as they met in his opulent office. I've heard a lot about your little project. It's ambitious, I'll give you that. But ambition doesn't always pay off. Kunle didn't rise to the bait. I'm not here to argue with you, Mr. Badejo. I'm here to ask why you're trying to undermine something that's helping people. Badejo chuckled. Helping people? Or helping yourself? You're too naive, boy. This world doesn't reward good intentions, it rewards power. Then let my actions speak for themselves, Kunle replied firmly. If the project succeeds, you'll have no choice but to admit you were wrong. Badejo's smile faltered, but he said nothing more. Kunle left the meeting feeling both anxious and determined. Over the next month, Kunle doubled his efforts to ensure the project's success. The villagers rallied behind him, grateful for the opportunities he had brought. Slowly, the rumors began to dissipate as the results became undeniable. One day, Madame Abeni's business partners visited the village to see the progress for themselves. Chief Okoye, who had been Kunle's harshest critic, was the first to speak. You've proven me wrong, Kunle, he said grudgingly. This is impressive work. Mrs. Adisa nodded in agreement. You've shown us that wealth isn't just about money, it's about impact. Well done. Kunle felt a wave of relief and pride. He had not only earned their respect, but had also solidified his place in Madame Abeni's legacy. Madame Abeni leaned back, her gaze distant. Years ago, your father and I were partners, not just in business, but in life. We built everything you see here together. But we had different ideas about how to move forward. He wanted to build slowly, with integrity. I wanted to grow quickly, no matter the cost. Eventually, we parted ways. Kunle nodded, feeling a sense of fulfillment he had never known. The journey had been long and challenging, but he finally understood what Madame Abeni had been teaching him all along. Kunle's newfound sense of accomplishment was short-lived. Just as he began to settle into his role, an unexpected visitor arrived at Madame Abeni's mansion, Mr. Oladipo, a man from her distant past. Tall and imposing, with sharp features and a commanding presence, Mr. Oladipo carried an aura of authority that made the staff uneasy. Kunle watched from a distance as Madame Abeni greeted him in the grand hall. Her expression was one he hadn't seen before, a mix of wariness and suppressed anger. Oladipo, she said, her voice cool. What brings you here after all these years? Oladipo smiled faintly. Business, of course. I heard you've been grooming a successor. Thought I'd see this Kunle for myself. Kunle stepped forward cautiously, sensing that this wasn't just a casual visit. Madame Abeni turned to him and gestured for him to join them. This is Kunle, she said firmly. And yes, I'm preparing him to take over. Why do you care? Oladipo's gaze swept over Kunle, assessing him like a hawk sizing up its prey. Because, he said, if he's going to inherit everything, he needs to know the whole story. Later that evening, Madame Abeni summoned Kunle to her private chambers. She seemed tense, her usual composure shaken. Oladipo and I were once partners, she began. When I first started building my empire, he was my mentor. But he betrayed me, stole from me, sabotaged deals, and tried to take over everything I had built. Kunle's jaw tightened. Why is he back now? Because he sees you as a threat, Madam Abeni replied. He knows that if you succeed, it will validate everything I've done. And if there's one thing Oladipo can't stand, it's losing. Kunle nodded, his resolve hardening. What do you need me to do? Madam Abeni sighed. For now, nothing, but be prepared. Oladipo doesn't play fair. The next day, Oladipo called a meeting with some of Madam Abeni's business partners. Kunle was invited, but it quickly became clear that the meeting was more of a power play than a discussion. Let's be honest, Oladipo said, his voice smooth and confident. Madame Abeni has done remarkable work, but the future requires bold leadership. Someone with experience. Someone like me. Kunle clenched his fists under the table but kept his face neutral. Experience is important, he said calmly. But so is integrity. The future isn't just about maintaining power, it's about using it to make a difference. Oladipo smirked. And what makes you think you're qualified to do that, boy? Kunle met his gaze without flinching. Because I've earned the trust of the people Madame Abeni built this legacy for. Can you say the same? The tension in the room was palpable, but Kunle's words resonated with the business partners. Several nodded in agreement, and Oladipo's confident facade began to crack. That evening, Oladipo approached Kunle privately. His tone was less confrontational, but his words carried a hidden edge. You're ambitious, I'll give you that, he said. But ambition alone won't protect you. If you want to survive in this world, you'll need allies. Join me, and I'll ensure your success. Stay with Madame Abeni, and you'll inherit her enemies along with her empire. Kunle's mind raced. The offer was tempting, but it went against everything he stood for. After a moment, he spoke. I appreciate the offer, he said evenly. But my loyalty isn't for sale. Oladipo's smile turned cold. We'll see how long that lasts. The next morning, Kunle found Madame Abeni in her study, her expression grim. Oladipo is planning something, she said. I can feel it. He won't stop until he tears everything apart. Kunle nodded. Then we need to be ready. Whatever he's planning, we'll face it together. Madame Abeni's gaze softened. You've come a long way, Kunle. But this fight isn't just about me. It's about protecting everything we've built. And everything you're going to build. Kunle felt a surge of determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it head-on. Kunle prepared himself for what felt like the ultimate test. Oladipo's presence had unsettled everyone, and the tension around Madame Abeni's estate was palpable. As the days passed, whispers of Oladipo's schemes began to surface. He was rallying some of Madame Abeni's older business partners to challenge her authority and remove Kunle from her plans entirely. One evening, Kunle and Madame Abeni sat together in her study. The weight of the situation hung heavily between them. Kunle, she said softly. You've proven your loyalty and integrity time and again. But this fight isn't just mine, it's yours now too. Are you ready to defend everything we've worked for? Kunle nodded firmly. Yes, madam. I won't let Oladipo destroy what you've built, or the legacy you want to leave behind. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Oladipo summoned a meeting with the business partners, Madame Abeni and Kunle in attendance. He laid out his case with the precision of a seasoned manipulator. Let's be honest, he began, his voice dripping with calculated charm. Madame Abeni's methods are outdated. She's clinging to ideals that no longer serve us. And this boy, he gestured toward Kunle, is too inexperienced to lead us forward. I propose a new direction, with myself at the helm. Kunle stood, his expression calm but his voice steady. Oladipo, your proposal is nothing more than a hostile takeover. You're not here to build, you're here to tear down. What Madame Abeni has built isn't just a business, it's a legacy of trust, responsibility and integrity. If that doesn't matter to you, then you're not fit to lead. The room fell silent. Madame Abeni watched Kunle closely, her expression unreadable. Oladipo smirked. Big words from someone so young. But words won't save you when the numbers are against you. The business partners were called to vote on who they believed should lead the empire moving forward. The room buzzed with tension as each partner cast their vote. When the final tally was revealed, the decision was clear: Kunle and Madame Abeni retained their positions of leadership. Oladipo's face darkened. You've made a mistake, he said coldly. This isn't over. Madame Abeni stood, her presence commanding. Oh, it's over, Oladipo. Your time here is done. Leave, and don't return. With Oladipo gone, Kunle and Madame Abeni worked to stabilize the empire. The business partners, impressed by Kunle's integrity and resolve, rallied behind him. The village project flourished, becoming a shining example of sustainable development and community empowerment. One evening, Madame Abeni called Kunle to the garden where they had shared so many important conversations. She handed him a document, a deed transferring control of her estate and businesses to him. This is yours now, she said. You've earned it. Kunle hesitated, overwhelmed by the gesture. Madam, I don't know if I can live up to your legacy. Madame Abeni smiled, her eyes filled with pride. You've already surpassed it, Kunle. And now, it's time for you to create your own. The moral lesson. Kunle's journey teaches us that true wealth isn't found in money or power, but in integrity, resilience, and staying true to one's values. Life is filled with challenges and temptations, but those who remain steadfast in their principles will find success that lasts. In the end, Kunle's greatest achievement wasn't inheriting Madame Abeni's empire, it was proving to himself and others that he could lead with honor, compassion, and vision. Thank you for watching this story of ambition, integrity, and legacy. Remember, the choices we make define who we are and the impact we leave behind. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share and subscribe for more inspiring tales.